Hello and welcome to my series of conversations with men and women as ideas, vision and philosophy define our contemporary world. My guest today is a member of the European Parliament. He's been Prime Minister of France from 1988 to 1991. He belongs to the Socialist group, but he is above all a significant leading thinker, an articulator of socialist philosophy who has worked tirelessly for its causes and agendas. I'm delighted to welcome Mr. Michel Rocard to this program.
Thank you.
Mr. Rocard, you have been a socialist and you have worked very hard to move socialism, in a sense, in France to the center. You have celebrated, in some senses, the role of the private sector in a socialist economy. You have famously said that government doesn't work by decree, and less so economies don't work by decree. Then what do they work by? What is the system that keeps them ticking?
I think that the answer to this question is very simple. Historians have looked upon to human history for 6,000 years, out of which 5,800 are in awful poverty, and the citizens of Napoleon Bonaparte were not richer than the citizens of the Roman Empire. We all know that. The explosion is called capitalism. And it is not less now, about 200 years ago. And what has been new is that instead of having some thinkers, or emperors, or priests even, or kings, who decide for development, capitalism had invented a system in which everyone can go, create a company, produce richness. And that is a worldwide absolute revolution. The system is cruel, and socialism was born all throughout the world, including India. It didn't fully succeed still. The Congress is in common history with these debates. And I have in my youth an Indian friend called Nath Pai, who was the leader of the Young Social Democrats in India. Okay. The system is very cruel, very efficient, we know. This efficiency has permitted to correct the cruelty, but the system is terribly unstable. Now, what happened in the socialist field, roughly in the world? Globally, the challenge to build another economy with administered control on economy has failed. It was called communism. It didn't succeed. The international socialist movement split. The French are not at ease on what they choose. Most of the Socialist International now says our job is to preserve market economy, but to stabilize it by a better regulation. That's what we say, sir, in most of the Social Democratic International, with a weakness and some hesitation in the French party, in which I try to draw them until a clear choice.
You have eloquently argued, and you just mentioned how sort of thousands of years of history, and then with the onset, with the sort of arrival of capitalism, in a sense, the basic equities have not changed. The issues of equity haven't been addressed, and you've argued that the condition of the poor relative to the rich and the numbers and the percentages haven't substantially changed with the new market economies. Yet, ironically, I was reading an article in The Economist, the bastion of sort of middle-of-the-road liberal economics, that was holding out a lot of the French social systems of healthcare and in looking after issues of unemployment and issues that you addressed as being one of the great successes of France relative to what, say, the United States has been able to provide for its citizens. So there is a perception, certainly, that the social sector in France has been substantially successful, though expensive. and not entirely achieving the goals and ideals that someone like you represented.
You hit on the tough issues. Funnily enough, the problems that France meets in terms of economic regulation and economic theory could have something in common with the Indian ones. Because you remember how much President Nehru didn't want the capitalist economy to win too much in India, and chose for foreign trade, but also for internal affairs, a better relation with the Soviet Union and a place of administered economy as a precaution for some damage. What is the balance sheet of that? A certain social equilibrium which is respected, but not enough growth. In a way, we can say something of that kind in France. It is true that France has preserved, best in the world after the Scandinavians, probably, and the Dutch. The Scandinavians, the Dutch are the best social protection organized system. France has preserved a level of social protection which makes unemployment a bit less terrible or terrifying than anywhere else, and which produce one of the best health public managed system in the world, most likely. The price of all that is a slowing of growth, and there is a bit more. All these items are not part of the global capitalist regulation, worldwide capitalist regulation. This is a tough discovery for India. This is a tough discovery for France. Do not include social protection and public services as a key stabilizing regulator. Capitalism is fantastically efficient. You in India have discovered a takeoff, a quickness of takeoff since 15 years. Extraordinary. And linked to the fact that you have abandoned some of your brakes to development. Result is fantastic efficiency. The result is that 10 years you have that doubles your private, your gross national product, but the result includes the fact that inequalities grow. One can already be satisfied with the fact that when everything grows very fast, even the poorest have a small plus and not a small less. But even this small plus for the poorest is in a diminishing percentage of the global richness. So this system is morally contestable and terrifically efficient. That is what happened in France. And we are now facing the fact that the better functioning of the global worldwide system, which comes from United States, Great Britain, needs public services to be diminished, needs social protection to be weakened in order for the profit economy to take solid power. And its power is great.
You're watching a conversation with the former Prime Minister of France, a member of the European Parliament, the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Michel Rocard. We'll be right back after a break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with the former Prime Minister of France. Do you like to be remembered and celebrated as the former Prime Minister of France? You've had, that was, that many 15 odd years ago, and you have led such an intellectually rigorous life, redefining, dimensions of political economy. You write extensively on a whole range of issues. I was reading one of your recent sort of passions has been water, and the issue of the right to water, and how that is inherently difficult to define, difficult to enforce and implement.
Well, first of all, I'm very thankful and proud to be addressed this way, and thank you very much, sir. Second, France has a very strange constitution in which there is a diarchy. The president has considerable powers, but the prime minister has less considerable powers, but is technically the machine conductor for government making. And that probably comes from ancient traditions, from the republics number 3 and 4 before. Still it is. And in this meaning, we had a President, François Mitterrand, very cultured man, an author. He writes fiction books. He's a fantastic legal advisor.
But you were at odds with him. He was the man who went to sort of nationalization and wanted far greater a vision that was a lot more state-oriented, and you were for free.
This was purely French. He didn't speak any foreign language. In fact, did not feel at home anywhere else than in France, and aggravated in a way the Franco-French image of our stability constitutions. I'm the reverse in a way. I have traveled outside the world, 114 nations. Few French have tried to discover and understand the foreign world as I did. And I try to contribute to a change in the French culture, in the attitude towards others, especially for the the Union of Europe, but the relations with the United States or even with India, which is my 4th journey and not the first. I tried to open my country more than that. And my feeling is that I did quite a lot, but not enough.
So what agendas do you seek, do you have on this visit to India? Is India only important because it's in some senses seems the fashion of the season, because suddenly we're talking about growth rates in excess of 9%, and they might represent useful and important financial markets for the European Union? Is it all about commerce ultimately?
Not only. In my country, I have constructed a criticism of the media system which is not Franco-centered. It is worldwide centered. But I don't know what is the case of the Indian media, which is that roughly the way you work is more and more centered on events, on short term, on the next electoral campaign, and less on long-term views.
So what is the European interest and the motive for the European Union and your fourth visit to India?
Within the 20 or 30 years that come.
Do you fear that?
Well, your rate of growth is double ours, if not 3 times. Your birth rate is more than double ours, and France is the only European country which goes on producing enough babies to renew the population.
Yeah, close to 1.9 something, isn't it?
Yeah,
yes.
Absolutely. Yes, you are well aware. So many Europeans speak concerning themselves about decline. The world is wrong with France. But therefore, how will we share the field of world trade in 30 years? India plus China, you will need roughly 45% of the share, in which you have 5 to 10% today. Imagining the enormous absurdities, intifada, they would say in Arab, soulèvement, absurd, I think the English word. This is very worrying. And those countries, India maybe, France maybe too, in which the thinking power, the thinkers, the authority of not only television producers, but even book writers, is centered on the next 5 years. Mm-hmm. Something doesn't work there.
I mentioned water because one of the issues of this competition and the percentages of trade is the available resources and the impact that we will have on the environment.
Absolutely.
And I mentioned your piece that I read on water and the right to water. quite apart from the right to energy and a whole range of other issues. But let's look at water as an example, since you've written about this. And how do you define this idea of right to water between nations? You've also talked about between governments and civil society, local governments. How are we going to manage this issue of water?
Water is very clear of one problem, but there are many other examples. I am no more sure that it is possible to regulate the world with 199 or 200 national sovereignties having a full right to oppose anything what the others decide. The problem of water is not only a problem of sharing. There are resources which are scarce to share, but it's a problem of managing as well. I remember Jacques Attali, Chancellor of the French President, telling me 25 years ago, we, humanity, are probably capable to treat the droughts of Bangladesh, but the condition is a World Organization of Nations in which the way trees grow on the crops of the Himalayan are managed together in order to protect the regime of waters all along, which needs some special agreement between nations, creating an entity managed together by China, India, Nepal, and Bangladesh. If we don't do that, things will go worse.
You're talking about a model of cooperation and harmony between nations, and again you have articulated a vision for the European Union, which is a remarkable success story. And you've also said that people who, when the European Union was sort of being initiated, who imagined that the European Union would be one large nation with its own military and its own united currency and what have you, were mistaken, and that it has evolved in different and exciting ways to become a very influential soft power. What is your vision, and in what ways do you celebrate the European Union, and what model and lessons does it hold for the rest of the world?
Technically, the European Union is the producer of 8 treaties. The first founding, not the biggest, but the first founding, was negotiated in 1949 and implemented in 1951. That is now 50 years for the biggest treaty, 57. In the ideas of the founders, it was clear that in order to look for better efficiency, we should have a common direction, common management of our economics, of our finance, of our budget, of our diplomacy, of our armies, and the rest. The story is such that any enlargement permitting to manage our finance first, and our economy and our trade has been successful, and that the Council of Ministers has already said no to any further integration of our foreign policy, of our armies, etc. So Europe is now something very strange, no example in previous history. Europe is an entity of public international law, of which the geographical definition is not the key. Europe is not defined by borders and has permanently changing borders. We have no common military policy except for humanitarian needs, and therefore no diplomacy. Therefore, our foreign policy concerning immigration, United Nations decisions, veto, etc., are national. Are national. But this is compatible with the fact that we have united the biggest economic and financial power in the world, first trader, first importer, first exporter, and since we try to correlate scientific research, first future producer agent in all this world.
We'll come to that in a moment. You're watching a conversation with the member of the European Parliament, the Socialist Group, Michel Rocard. We'll be right back after a short break. Don't go away. Welcome back to a continuing conversation with Michel Rocard, a former Prime Minister of France. You have argued so eloquently that the American response to 9/11 and the declaration of the war on terror, the very use of the word war, has been inappropriate and represented an erroneous strategy. What is the kind of strategy?
It's not only an affair of 2001. It's a long story of an absolute almighty in power, which goes, it's not an opinion of mine, I hope it's a fact, an observation, which is that the most powerful army of all history is now drowned in two countries, Afghanistan and Iraq, without any possibility to get out of there, and without any serious possibility to make another war somewhere else.
What would you say to the Americans? What should they do now? Or what should the world do now, in a sense? Why leave it just to the Americans?
Please, American friends, do like the Europeans do, like the Indians more and more, and observe that decisions in the world are not less and less by force, and more by consensus, by soft power, by negotiations. And that is what I feel is tomorrow's world. That is the only possible way.
In the context of the Al-Qaeda and the acts of terrorism that the Americans were responding to, who do you negotiate with? And in what ways? I mean, how does this unfold?
Al-Qaeda is obliging us to live with a feeling of dangerosity, which the media system exaggerates enormously. The killings of people on 10 years of terrorism is 100th of what it was in a period of plain war. We have to take the habit that the way we live together are unpleasant for minorities of people who are ready to kill because of that. And we can't help it, because probably they are wrong. And we are more near rationality, conviviality, tolerance and friendship than they are. Still, we can't help it. And therefore, time for pure strength and force seem to be diminishing in human affairs. And this is the key opening of an improvement of relations between India and Europe. Because India is not yet the first row of the first nuclear powers, even compared with China or Soviet Union. Europe has hardly any more force, but both of us push very strongly on trade, soft power, rules of the law, a better improvement of the United Nations organizations.
You had alluded earlier in our conversation to India and China, and there is this sort of great unarticulated, shall we say, fear of China still. Why is China apparently, whether you look at the issue of Tibet, you look at the issue of the United States dollars that the Chinese might hold. You look at aspects of India's foreign policy. There is a perception that much of the world, because of China's military power, its markets, is engaged in a policy of appeasement. Would you say that's a fair description?
What I would say is that the judgment of this problem is uncertain, contradictory. We do not all assume the same vision, but the fact that for the 30 years to come we shall live in peace or discover the hot translation into war of our present trade conflicts depends on the way we shall analyze all that. I am not shocked by the present presentation that China chooses of itself. It is true that China grows very fast, demands for, as does India, a legitimate room in a country, in the world, in which sizes have been inherited of the 20th century.
But doesn't seem to conform, certainly, to the Western Indian liberal worldview of democracy, of celebrating diversity, of openness, and the values that, say, the European Union and India and the United States, or much of the world, of equity and freedom, that we would celebrate.
I'm not sure we need to precise those items with values and excessive words. We begin with trade. We find ourselves with mysteries, things to exchange, and priority for peace. We do want trade conditions not to provoke jealousy, poverty, violence.
Are you saying to me, as someone who has held public office, that the ultimate yardstick is that there should be a peace, even if it's peace of the graveyard, because we must do anything that is necessary to preserve the processes of economic transaction and trade? Is it just romanticism that the values that you worked for as a student leader in your youth, the 68 riots in France, of a larger ideal? Is that just sort of romanticism? Is the hard reality of international politics and trade? Do you feel cynical about it sometimes?
No, because I think even the most cynical begin with a balance of strength way of thinking, and know now that with the multiplication of nuclear weapons, war can be immensely destructive. My vision is that we all entered by force and not by values in the observation that living together is better than killing one another, and calls for surveillance of cease-fight light, but calls for management of resources of water, calls for management of resources in heat, etc., etc.
Well, given this sort of, how do I put it, almost mechanistic, material vision of the world, what is your personal, forget public life, forget the engagement between nations, what is your personal dream, your personal utopia? For yourself, for your family, for your country, for the world?
It is clearly that the values which I live with, the values which I wish to transmit.
What are those?
To my
what are those values?
Well,
what's some of those values?
Ethics, the disappearance of any thinking in terms of human being, accepting that some would be superior to others, an equal respect to any form of human life. And my main hope is that the presentation of those values should be made in the world more and more comprehensible and acceptable in all parts of the planet.
Mr. Rocard, thank you very much. This has been a great honor and a great privilege. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir.